Eleanor of Aquitaine was born in the early to mid 1120s, somewhere between the years 1122 to 1124. Her life would be both an exceptionally long one, considering the age in which she lived, and also a highly eventful one. Named after her mother, Eleanor became Duchess of Aquitaine upon the death of her father, Duke William X, when she was still only a young girl. Just a couple of months later, Eleanor married the 17-year-old Prince Louis, heir to the French crown. A matter of days later, King Louis VI died, and Prince Louis succeeded as Louis VII. Eleanor was now Queen of France. But both Louis and Eleanor were very different people. Louis was a deeply pious man, too pious for Eleanor's liking. She would complain later on that Louis was almost monk-like in nature. However, Louis's piety was tested in 1143. During a campaign against the Count of Champagne, Louis's forces burned a church down to the ground, which led to the death of well over 1,000 people, possibly as many as 1,500, attracting the wrath of the Pope. Louis was deeply remorseful for the disaster, and part of his penance was to go on crusade. Eleanor would accompany him. The Second Crusade, as it's known, was a total disaster, however, in more ways than one. The Christian army, led by Louis and Conrad III of Germany, accomplished next to nothing and were effectively routed. For Louis, one of the few comforts was that he was able to visit the Holy Land. If rumours were true, Eleanor sought comfort of a different kind. Undoubtedly unimpressed by the way the crusade was going, Eleanor was accused of having an affair with her uncle, Raymond of Toulouse. These rumours reached the ears of the French king. During a campaign which was riddled with problems, from military defeats to widespread sickness and disease, with Conrad himself falling gravely ill at one point, these messages were not what Louis needed. On returning to the West, divorce between Louis and Eleanor became inevitable. Eleanor was clearly bored in the marriage, and Louis still without a male heir. Only two daughters had been born to the couple. The marriage was eventually annulled. Eleanor was now a free woman, and, as Duchess of Aquitaine, a hugely attractive target for ambitious men across France. Her eyes, however, were set on the young and dashing Duke of Normandy, Henry Plantagenet. Henry was around a decade younger than Eleanor and a man of quite remarkable energy. For Eleanor, this marriage was a no-brainer. The wedding went ahead, and Eleanor's decision was soon vindicated when King Stephen of England made Henry his legal heir. In 1154, Eleanor would become Queen of England, having only been Queen of France 2 years earlier. Eleanor is the only woman to have been Queen of both England and France. Her first duty was to give Henry heirs, which she had failed, in inverted commas, to do for Louis. She had already made a good start on this front. A boy had been born to Eleanor and Henry in 1153, before Henry became king. He was named William. Sadly, William died in childhood, but more sons would follow, including Henry the Young King in 1155. He would be crowned as his father's co-ruler in 1170. The other sons were Richard the Lionheart, Geoffrey, who would become Duke of Brittany, and a boy who would become King John. Eleanor would also produce several more daughters, who would make notable marriages, including to the kings of Sicily and Castile. Eleanor's job was emphatically done on the childbearing score. She had given Henry heirs and spares, as well as daughters to use for political alliances. Eleanor had been pushing 30 by the time of her marriage to Henry, and at the time of her last labour, giving birth to John on Christmas Eve 1166, she was well into her 40s. Henry, remember, was much younger than Eleanor, and as he saw his wife move past childbearing age, his eyes began to wander. He kept mistresses, the most famous of whom was a girl named Rosamond. Unamused by her husband's lack of loyalty and gratitude, the story goes that Eleanor had Rosamond poisoned. Whether that story was true or not, Eleanor would play a role in the rebellion of her sons, led by Henry the young king. Stifled by Henry II's control over them, the young king and his brothers turned to Henry the young king's father-in-law, Louis VII, whose daughter, Margaret, the young king was married to. Although Louis had granted Eleanor the divorce she had wanted, her marriage to Henry II would have been most unwelcome. Already Duke of Normandy at the time of the marriage, Henry would then have possession of both Aquitaine and soon to be England, making him a very powerful rival to Louis. The rebellion of his son-in-law now gave Louis a chance to stir up trouble for Henry II, and it had been his former wife, ironically, who had instigated it. Henry the young king targeted Normandy, aided by the Count of Flanders and Louis VII, but Henry II, with his renowned speed, stormed across the Channel and drove his son, now the enemy, out of the duchy. Even Louis had to marvel at Henry's speed, remarking how the English king could seemingly travel from Ireland to England to France within a blink of an eye. Knowing his troubles with his sons were far from over, Henry II turned his wrath on Eleanor, whom he held responsible for this treachery. In 1174, he imprisoned Eleanor, where she would remain in comfortable confinement until Henry II died in 1189. For a woman such as Eleanor, these 15 years would have been hugely frustrating. It is of no use blaming either Henry or Eleanor for the situation. The truth is, as is often the case, both were to blame to a certain extent. Henry, if he had shown a touch more flexibility when it came to delegating land power to his sons, may have avoided the rebellion altogether. Eleanor, for her part, needed to show a touch more realism. She paid the price with an extended period of political exile, which would have been almost hellish for her. However, on the succession of Richard the Lionheart to the throne of England, the situation would change dramatically for Eleanor. Richard shared a close bond with his mother and was the favourite of the four sons who lived into adulthood. Henry the young king had died in 1183, which made Richard heir to the English crown. Another brother, Geoffrey, had also predeceased Henry II. Eleanor was immediately released on Richard's becoming king, and she would act as regent during Richard's reign when he was absent from England. And famously, that would be for an extended period of time, as Richard would go on crusade, spend a year as a hostage on his return to the West, and campaign frequently against his friend turned foe, Philip II of France. Eleanor would be assisted in the governing of England by the great men of the realm, most notably William Marshal. In early September 1189, Eleanor watched on as Richard was crowned King of England. The Queen Dowager, as she now was referred to by some as the Eagle, as she continued to stretch her wings over England and France. As she sat imperiously at the coronation, that comparison may have been apt. During the later years of Henry II's reign, both he and Richard had made vows to go on crusade. Henry never made it, but on becoming king, Richard made preparations straight away for the journey. Money was raised from reluctant sources in ruthless fashion. Although Richard set out for the crusade, a marriage was still to be arranged for him. This was to be to Berengaria of Navarre. Eleanor, by now in her late 60s, travelled to Navarre to collect Berengaria and escorted her to meet Richard at Messina. Eleanor would then return to England to keep a watchful eye over her troublesome youngest son, John. The progress that Richard made during the Third Crusade has been debated by many. Some feel that the Crusaders' inability to retake Jerusalem from Saladin meant it was a failure. Others feel that the Crusaders, Richard in particular, deserve greater credit for the gains they did make. What is for sure is that Richard firmly established himself as a brilliant general during the Crusade. On returning westwards in 1192, however, Richard was kidnapped by the Duke of Austria, who handed over the King of England to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, Richard's enemy, who now demanded an enormous ransom for his royal prisoner. A task not helped by the fact that Richard's subjects had already coughed up considerable money to help finance his crusade. Nonetheless, Richard, thanks to his mother and father, ruled over an extensive empire, and Eleanor was eventually able to raise the money required. However, the financial impact of this would still be felt during the reign of Richard's brother, King John. Richard the Lionheart died after being struck by a crossbow bolt during a siege in April 1199. This meant Eleanor had now outlived all but one of her 5 sons. Richard was succeeded as King of England by John, whose reign started badly and continued to get worse as it went on. The French king, Philip II, began to dismantle the empire of Henry II, and desperate to reverse the losses that he was suffering, John led expensive campaigns in France, with his elderly mother almost getting caught in the crossfire, with John forced to rescue Eleanor at one point from the hands of enemy forces. Eleanor eventually died in 1204, aged 80 or perhaps 82. The fact was, although in retirement during her final days, Eleanor remained a figure of comfort and strength for John. Throughout her life, Eleanor had shown herself to be a woman of iron will, sometimes to her own detriment, with an energy that matched even that of her second husband, Henry II.